The carriage wheels moaned against the frozen path as it climbed toward Harrowmere Hall, a vast estate crouched upon the cliffs of Northumberland like some sleeping creature of stone. The wind from the sea was a living thing, cold, unrelenting, pressing against the windows with ghostly fingers. Inside, a young woman sat clutching a frayed bundle of belongings to her chest. Her name was Eveline Hart, and everything she owned could have fit within that small cloth bag. A faded photograph of her mother, a Bible with cracked binding, and a folded sheet of music, her mother's lullaby. When the carriage stopped, she looked up at the towering manor and felt her courage shiver. The iron gates bore the crest of the Blackwell family, a raven clutching a sword beneath a crown. The driver muttered something under his breath about curses, and Eveline thought she saw his hand tremble as he tipped his hat before leaving her in the snow. Harrowmere Hall was a place of silence. Even the crows refused to linger long upon its parapets. Inside, the air was heavy with something unsaid, like the echo of grief that refused to die. A grey-haired woman met her at the door, Mrs. Pendry, the housekeeper. Her eyes were sharp, though not unkind. "You're the new maid," she said. "Keep your head down, do your work, and never, ever sing within these walls." Eveline blinked. "Sing, ma'am?" Mrs. Pendry's gaze hardened. "His Grace despises music. It is not permitted. Not since, well, you'll hear soon enough." She was led through endless corridors hung with portraits, stern men, cold-eyed women, and one painting draped in black cloth. When Eveline dared to glance, she saw a name engraved beneath the frame. Lady Celeste Montrose. The Duke's late fiancée, she realized. The one whose death had sealed this house in mourning. That night, she lay awake in the servants' quarters, listening to the sound of the sea crashing against the cliffs below. She thought of her mother's voice, the lullaby that had once softened every hardship, and she whispered it under her breath. Just a few notes, soft as breath. She did not know that someone else was listening. High above, in the east wing, Duke Adrian Blackwell stood by the window, half-shadowed by the fire's dying light. His face was carved with weariness, his grey-blue eyes hollow. The faint scar along his jaw glimmered when the lightning struck. For years he had banished sound from his life, the laughter of guests, the music of pianos, the hum of company. Silence was safer. Silence did not remind him of the scream that had ended Celeste's life. But that night, as the storm raged, he heard a voice drift up from the servants' hall. It was faint, almost imagined, a lullaby, simple and trembling, yet heartbreakingly pure. Adrian froze. For a moment, he thought it was her, Celeste's voice. But no, this one was softer, earthier, full of something his fiancée's polished tones never carried. Hope. He closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him like the first breath after drowning. When it ended, the silence that followed felt crueler than before. "Who was that?" he whispered to no one, his hand clenching around the window frame. Below, Eveline turned on her thin mattress and sighed, unaware that her small act of comfort had disturbed the heart of a man who had sworn never to feel again. The next morning, the manor returned to its usual rhythm, quiet, distant, mechanical. But the Duke found himself restless. He could not focus on the letters stacked on his desk, nor the estate accounts waiting for his seal. Each time he dipped his quill, that voice returned to him, soft, haunting, uninvited. When he finally rang for Mrs. Pendry, his tone was calm, but his eyes betrayed unease. "There was singing last night," he said. "Find who did it, and tell her never to do it again." Mrs. Pendry bowed. "As you wish, Your Grace." But when she left, she smiled faintly to herself. So the house breathes again, she murmured. That evening, Eveline hummed again while scrubbing the grand staircase, unaware that every note she released was finding its way into the cracks of a heart long buried under grief. And though the Duke told himself he despised the sound, his steps carried him to the upper balcony where he could hear her better. For the first time in years he did not flee from music. He listened. For 3 nights the halls of Harrowmere held a sound they had not known in years, soft, human, living. It slipped through the cracks of the old walls like candlelight under a locked door. The Duke did not summon it, nor did he wish to. But it came to him all the same, and every time the voice rose from the servants' wing, he found himself standing in stillness, listening as though to a ghost. Adrian Blackwell had learned long ago that music had a cruel edge. His fiancée, Lady Celeste Montrose, had been a pianist of renown. The night she died, she had insisted on a carriage ride through the storm after their engagement ball. The wheel had snapped on the cliff road. She had been found with her hands still clutching the sheet of music she'd played for him hours earlier. The melody haunted him, the last thing she ever touched, the last thing he ever heard, before silence devoured his world. Since then he'd decreed no music in Harrowmere, no violins, no pianos, not even the humming of the servants when they polished the silver. Silence, he believed, was the only way to keep madness from seeping in. But the lullaby, the one sung by that unseen voice, was different. It didn't taunt him with the past. It didn't demand remembrance. It simply existed, pure and human, and it threaded itself through the coldness of his heart until the walls inside him began to tremble. On the 4th evening, he could bear it no longer. Following the sound down the main corridor, he stopped at the entrance of the ballroom, a vast chamber covered in dust sheets. The voice came from inside. Pushing the door open quietly, he found her there. Eveline, the new housemaid, was kneeling by the fireplace, her sleeves rolled up, her hair tied loosely, the faintest trace of soot on her cheek. She was singing to herself as she worked, unaware of the man in the doorway. Her song was the same one that had reached him through stone and rain, soft, simple, but achingly alive. It was a lullaby born of comfort, not performance. Each word felt like warmth poured into frozen air. "Stop," he said sharply. Eveline gasped and turned. Her brush clattered to the marble floor. "Your Grace, I'm sorry, I didn't—" "You didn't what?" His tone was clipped, the command of a man long used to being obeyed. "Did you not hear the rule? No music in this house." "Yes, my lord," she whispered. "Forgive me, it's a habit. When I work, I sing. I meant no disrespect." He studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment. The firelight flickered against her face, making her look both fragile and defiant. Most servants would have looked away, but her eyes, though lowered, did not tremble. "Whose song was that?" he asked at last. "My mother's," she said softly. "She used to sing it when I was afraid. It helps me forget the cold." The Duke's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He had not expected truth so simply given. "Fear is a foolish thing to dwell on," he muttered. "Perhaps," she said, "but songs make it smaller." He frowned. "You think music makes suffering bearable?" She looked up then, meeting his eyes. "No, my lord, I think it reminds us we are still alive." For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Somewhere, deep within the manor, the wind moaned through the chimneys, as though the house itself waited for his reply. But Adrian turned abruptly, the heavy fabric of his coat swirling behind him. "See that you remember your place, Miss Hart," he said, his voice quiet now. "The walls of Harrowmere have no need for life." When he left the ballroom, she exhaled shakily. Her hands trembled, but she smiled faintly. He listened, she thought. For all his coldness, he had stood there long enough to hear her song. That was something. Upstairs, the Duke poured himself a glass of brandy he would not drink. The echo of her voice refused to leave his mind. Each note wound around his memory, not as pain, but as an ache of longing. He went to the grand piano in the drawing-room, a relic he hadn't touched since Celeste's death, and ran his fingers lightly across the keys. Dust lifted, shimmering in the candlelight. He pressed one key softly. The sound was hesitant, fragile, like a heartbeat after years of sleep. The note lingered. For the first time in nearly a decade, music had touched Harrowmere Hall again. He shut the piano abruptly, his breath uneven. "No," he whispered. "Not again. I will not lose myself to it." But when the house fell, silent once more, he realized silence was now the thing that frightened him most. That night, as the sea roared below the cliffs and rain lashed against his windows, Adrian Blackwell dreamed of a woman's voice, gentle, mortal, and unafraid. When he woke, he found himself whispering words he hadn't spoken since Celeste's funeral. "Her song makes me feel alive." The days that followed unfurled like mist across the moors, slow, grey, and watchful. Harrowmere Hall, once so comfortably bound in silence, began to tremble with something unfamiliar. Somewhere beneath its vaulted ceilings, a tune moved like a secret thread. The Duke would hear it faintly as he walked the upper corridors, as if the walls themselves were humming back a memory he had tried too long to forget. He told himself that it was irritation that drew him from his study at night, candle in hand, to wander through the deserted wings. He told himself that he was simply making certain the servants obeyed his rules. But each time, when the faint melody drifted upward from the servants' wing, his pace slowed. He could never quite bring himself to stop it. Sometimes he would pause outside the old ballroom, the one where Celeste had once danced, beneath chandeliers bright as frost. The air still smelled faintly of wax and dust, and through the crack beneath the door came that gentle hum, Eveline's voice, weaving light into a house that had known only dusk. He found himself waiting for it. Once he stood in the shadows by the grand staircase and watched her cross the corridor, carrying a pail and brush, her hair loosened by the heat of work. She hummed as she walked, unaware of him. The faintest smile ghosted across his face before he caught himself. He turned away quickly, fingers tightening on the banister, as if to remind himself who he was. When morning came, he was harsher than usual with his steward, with the tenants, even with Mrs. Pendry. But the harshness was hollow, the anger sounded rehearsed. Mrs. Pendry saw through it. One evening, as she poured his tea, she said quietly, "It's a kind sound, Your Grace," the girl's voice. "The house seems less cruel for it." He fixed her with a cold stare. "I did not ask for sentiment, Mrs. Pendry." "No, sir," she said, not bowing this time. "But sometimes the Lord sends us what we need, not what we ask for." He did not answer, but when she left, the faintest thread of her words lingered in his mind like the echo of a note. That same night, Eveline stayed late in the ballroom, polishing the last of the brass sconces. The moonlight slanted through tall windows, throwing silver patterns across the floor. She began to hum again, quietly, timidly, as if testing whether the manor would allow it. The door creaked. She turned sharply. There, in the half-light, stood the Duke. He was not in his coat, only a dark waistcoat and shirt, the fire from the hearth brushing his scar in copper tones. Her heart jumped. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I didn't hear you come in." "I imagine you didn't," he said. "You were preoccupied. She set down her cloth, keeping her gaze on the floor. "I'm sorry, I'll stop." He hesitated, the protest caught in his throat. "No, don't." She looked up, startled. He moved closer, the faint sound of his boots against marble echoing like a heartbeat. "What is that song?" "A lullaby, my lord. My mother's." "And you sing it? For comfort?" "Yes," she whispered. "And because this house feels lonely, I thought perhaps it might want company." He let out a short breath that was almost a laugh, though no warmth reached his eyes. "You think stone walls long for comfort?" "Not the walls," she said softly. "The people inside them." He looked at her a long time. For years he had trained himself not to look at anyone too closely. Faces had a way of slipping into dreams. But her eyes held no pity, only understanding. He could not bear it. "You're a bold one," he murmured. "I only speak what I see, your grace." "And what do you see?" She hesitated. "A man who listens more than he admits." For a long moment, the air between them thickened with silence and something else. Something he had not felt in years. Then with a small nod, he turned away. "Finish your work," he said quietly. "And keep your song, Miss Hart. It seems Harrowmere tolerates it." When he left, Eveline sank onto the edge of the hearth, her pulse still trembling. She did not know why her words had come so easily, nor why his gaze had unsettled her so deeply. Upstairs in the east wing, the Duke stopped outside the portrait of Lady Celeste. He stared at it in the half-light, at her painted smile, perfect and untouchable. "I can't remember her voice anymore," he whispered. The realization struck like lightning. He felt neither guilt nor relief, only an aching emptiness that the memory of Eveline's song seemed to fill. He stood there until the candles burned low, hearing again the soft echo of that lullaby threading through the stone. And for the first time since the night of the accident, he did not feel haunted, only human. The following week, Harrowmere Hall began to change, so subtly at first that even the servants didn't notice. Fires burned longer in the hearths, candles flickered later into the night, and the air that once felt like frozen marble now carried a faint warmth. The Duke's footsteps, once heavy and echoing like judgment, softened. And at the heart of this transformation was one voice, a housemaid's quiet song threading through the corridors like sunlight through lace. Eveline sang without meaning to. It came as naturally to her as breath. When she worked alone, dusting the grand staircase or washing linen in the courtyard, the melodies rose unbidden, floating up to the rafters. The house, long deaf to beauty, seemed to listen. Even the other servants, who had grown used to silence, found themselves pausing to hear her. Mrs. Pendry, for all her sternness, would sometimes linger in the hall outside the kitchens, her hands folded, her head bowed as if in prayer. "It's a blessing, that voice," she murmured once to the cook. The last time Harrowmere heard music, it was followed by tragedy. Maybe this time it will bring peace. But gossip is a restless creature, and peace has never been safe in noble houses. One rainy afternoon, as the maids gathered near the laundry room, two of them whispered beneath the hiss of the iron. "They say the Duke stands outside the ballroom some nights," said one, wide-eyed. "Just listening." "Nonsense," said the other, though her tone was nervous. "The man's a ghost, not a lover. He hasn't smiled since the Lady Celeste died." "Still," the first one whispered, "he let her sing. That's something. You think maybe—" Eveline entered just then, carrying a basket of linens, and the conversation stopped mid-air. She could feel the eyes that followed her, hear the thoughts unspoken. Her face flushed, but she said nothing. She was a servant. She knew how quickly a whisper could become a weapon. That evening, as the sky turned the color of bruised violets, she went to the music room, a place locked for years but recently opened by the Duke's own hand. The grand piano sat beneath a shroud of dust, its ivory keys dull with neglect. She stood before it, hesitant. The weight of silence pressed around her like a held breath. Then she brushed her fingers across the keys, barely touching them. The faint note quivered in the air. Behind her, the door creaked. She turned, startled, but it was him. Adrian Blackwell stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He stepped into the room slowly, the soft thud of his boots the only sound between them. "You play," he said, though it wasn't a question. "I used to," she replied, her voice trembling. "My mother taught me before we lost everything." He nodded, coming to stand beside her, his reflection caught in the black lacquer of the piano lid, tall, scarred, distant. "Do you know what that is?" he asked, gesturing to the instrument. "A piano, my lord." He gave a small, humorless smile. It was hers, Lady Celeste's. She died the night after she played that last song. Eveline looked down, her heart aching for a pain that was not her own. "Then it must be precious to you." "It's cursed," he said flatly. "Every note on it reminds me that love kills." Her voice softened. "Love doesn't kill, my lord. Grief does." He turned sharply toward her, but she didn't flinch. Something in her tone, gentle but certain, struck through his armor. "You think me a coward," he said. "No," she whispered. "Only wounded." The words settled between them like dust motes in sunlight. For the first time in years, Adrian didn't retreat from the truth. He rested his gloved hand on the piano lid, the leather creaking softly. "If I asked you to sing again here, would you?" Eveline's breath caught. "Here?" He nodded. "For me?" Her pulse raced, but she lowered her eyes, nodding once. "If it would ease your sorrow." "It won't," he said quietly. "But perhaps it will teach me to live with it." When she sang, her voice rose gently, uncertain at first, then blooming as it filled the high ceiling. The melody was not Celeste's polished brilliance, but something older, truer, like a prayer whispered by someone who still believed. The Duke stood beside her, his head bowed slightly. At first his jaw was tight, his breath shallow, but then his shoulders eased. When the song ended, a single tear traced the scar along his cheek. "Forgive me," he murmured, almost to himself. "I had forgotten what beauty sounded like." She didn't answer. Some silences were too sacred for words. Outside the door, Mrs. Pendry stood with her hands clasped, listening. The servants would whisper about it by morning, the Duke who let a housemaid sing where no sound had lived in years. But for that moment there was no scandal, no rank, no ghost of Lady Celeste. There was only music, and a man rediscovering his heart through it. In the days that followed, Harrowmere Hall began to breathe again. What had once been a house of echoing silence now pulsed faintly with life. The laughter of servants in the kitchens, the rhythm of footsteps in the corridors, and above it all, the memory of one woman's song. The Duke did not forbid it, he did not mention it. But each morning when he passed through the great hall and heard Eveline's faint humming as she worked, something inside him loosened. A knot he hadn't realized had been tied for 10 long years. It started with small gestures, so small they might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. When the weather turned cold, a second fire was lit in the servants' wing, though no order had been given for it. The housekeeper found new linens delivered for the maids and fresh fruit brought from the market, luxuries Harrowmere's staff hadn't seen in a decade. "The Duke's instructions," Mrs. Pendry said, simply, though the servants looked at each other in quiet wonder. Eveline noticed the changes but said nothing. She carried on with her duties, though she could not shake the feeling that the Duke's gaze followed her, not in suspicion, but in something more searching. Once she passed him in the garden as he examined the frost-bitten roses. He nodded politely, something he had never done to a servant before. She curtsied, lowering her eyes, but her heart beat strangely fast. That evening, as she scrubbed the marble steps, he appeared again, carrying a book in one hand. "Miss Hart," he said. She rose quickly, startled. "Your Grace?" He hesitated as if second-guessing his own words. "There is a poem in this book," he said at last, "that I believe you might like." She blinked, unsure how to respond. He held out the worn volume, a collection of Byron's works, and his gloved hand brushed hers as she took it. "You read poetry, my lord?" "Once," he said, "when the world still made sense." "And does it make sense now?" she asked softly. He almost smiled, the faintest curve of lips. "No, but your voice makes it tolerable." The words slipped out before he could stop them. Her cheeks coloured, and he turned away quickly, adding in a brisk tone, "You may return the book when you've read it." She clutched it to her chest. "Thank you, Your Grace." From that day, something unseen began to bloom between them. It wasn't spoken, wasn't acknowledged, but it hung in the air, a fragile understanding that neither dared name. He began taking his tea in the conservatory, where he could hear her singing from the laundry courtyard below. He lingered in the library longer than usual, listening to the faint echoes of her laughter with the other maids. He even began speaking more gently to his staff, though his voice still carried the weight of command. Mrs. Pendry noticed it all. "Love is dangerous in a house built on grief," she warned quietly one evening as she poured his tea. "Love?" he repeated, feigning ignorance. "You mistake my tolerance for sentiment." She gave him a knowing look. "And you mistake your heart for something dead when it's only sleeping." That night, he couldn't sleep. He stood before Celeste's portrait, her painted eyes bright and empty, and felt no warmth, no pain. "Forgive me," he whispered, "but I can't remember the sound of you anymore." The next morning, he found Eveline in the garden, tending the frost-touched ivy near the chapel wall. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, stepping closer. "I like the cold," she replied. "It keeps me awake." He looked down at her hands, reddened from work, yet graceful as they brushed the leaves. "You could have been anything, you know," he murmured. "You have the voice of a duchess." She smiled faintly. "And yet I was born a maid. We don't get to choose our songs, my lord, only how we sing them." Her words struck him with quiet force. For the first time in years, Adrian Blackwell laughed, a sound raw and unfamiliar, but real. The wind carried it across the garden like a benediction. But laughter invites envy, and warmth invites warning. From the shadowed terrace above, Sir Halbert Grayson, the Duke's cousin, watched them with narrowed eyes. A flicker of cruel amusement touched his lips. "So," he murmured, "the great ghost of Harrowmere wakes for a servant girl." By nightfall, whispers had spread beyond the manor walls. The servants talked of the Duke's softened demeanour, of the strange fondness in his gaze when he looked upon Eveline Hart. In the nearby village, tongues wagged over ale and candlelight. "The Duke, who buried his bride, has found a new voice to haunt him." Eveline felt the shift in the air, the glances, the whispers, but she tried to ignore them. When she sang for herself, for her mother's memory, and perhaps, though she hardly admitted it, for him. That evening, when she passed by the library door, she heard the sound of a piano key pressed gently, tentatively, as though by a man remembering how to live. The Duke's voice followed, soft and unguarded. "Keep singing, Miss Hart. The house listens better when you do." And though neither of them saw the shadow of Sir Halbert slip down the hall, the echo of that moment would soon set into motion a storm neither was prepared to face. By the next fortnight, the gentle warmth that had crept through Harrowmere began to feel fragile, like sunlight on ice, too beautiful to last. The whispers that had once stayed confined to the servants' quarters spilled into the village, then into the parlours of London society. "The Duke of Harrowmere entertains his maid," they said, voices sharp with delight at scandal. "He lets her sing in his hall, just as the late Lady Celeste did before she died. Perhaps he means to replace one ghost with another." Sir Halbert Grayson was careful in how he fed these rumours. He never lied outright. He merely observed, exaggerated, and allowed gossip to grow in fertile soil. For years he had lived in the Duke's shadow, tolerated only because of blood. Harrowmere was a prize he could never inherit, but destroying it gave him satisfaction enough. One stormy evening, as the wind howled through the chimneys and the sea crashed violently below, Halbert approached the Duke's study. He found Adrian standing before the fire, the flickering light softening the scar on his face. "You've been generous to your staff, cousin," Halbert began smoothly. "A new fire in the servants' wing? Gifts of fruit, even poetry for a maid. It's touching." Adrian didn't look up. "Say what you mean, Halbert." Halbert stepped closer, the faintest smirk tugging his lips. "I mean the servants' talk, the village talks. They say you've found yourself a new muse, a new songbird." The Duke's eyes lifted, cold and dangerous. "Careful." Halbert only smiled wider. "Do you plan to marry her, then? Make a duchess of a girl who scrubs your floors? It would make quite the ballad, The Duke and the Housemaid. Perhaps she'll sing it herself." The sound of the Duke's fist striking the table cracked through the room like thunder. "Get out!" But Halbert wasn't finished. "Or perhaps she's cleverer than she looks. Perhaps she knows a wounded man is easy to tame. You were always too sentimental, Adrian." The Duke's voice was low, deadly. "Leave Harrowmere before I forget you are kin." For the first time, Halbert's confident mask faltered. He bowed with mock grace. "As you wish, your grace, but remember, when a man like you stoops for a servant, the world does not forgive." When he was gone, Adrian stood motionless. The fire popped, the clock ticked, and somewhere in the distance he thought he heard Eveline's voice, soft, unguarded, singing her mother's lullaby. It struck him then how easily one sound could shatter his composure. He pressed a hand to his chest, his pulse fierce. Was this love, or the same madness that once destroyed him? Downstairs, Eveline knew none of what had passed. She was in the ballroom, arranging candles along the piano, unaware that her very presence had become a weapon in another man's game. When the Duke entered, she smiled, but his face was tense, shadowed. "Is something wrong, Your Grace?" He hesitated. "You should leave Harrowmere for a time." Her expression faltered. "Leave? Only until the talk dies down." She stepped closer, confusion flickering across her face. "Have I offended you?" "No." His voice softened. "You've done nothing wrong. But this house devours kindness. I won't see it devour you." Her throat tightened. "And what of you?" "I am already part of its curse," he said quietly. She wanted to protest, to tell him she didn't care for whispers or titles, but she saw the pain in his eyes, and it silenced her. "If that is your wish, I will go," she said finally. He turned away, jaw clenched. It is. That night, when she packed her few belongings, she found the book of Byron's poems on her pillow. Inside was a folded note in his hand. Your voice reminded me I am not dead. Forgive me for sending you away. Tears blurred the words. She pressed the book to her chest, then left the manor before dawn. When the Duke discovered her absence, rage flared like lightning, at himself, at Halbert, at the cruel ease with which the world could twist beauty into sin. Fools, he muttered, storming into the courtyard, rain lashing against his face. All of them. Mrs. Pendry met him there, lantern in hand. She's gone, my lord. She left before sunrise. He stood still, drenched, silent. Then in a voice so low it was almost a prayer, he said, Find her, before the sea does. But the storm that night was merciless. No carriage could pass the cliffs, no horse could ride the flooded roads. And so, for the second time in his life, Adrian Blackwell stood by the window and watched the rain fall, knowing the woman he loved might be lost to it. When morning came, the sea lay grey and cruel beneath the cliffs, and the halls of Harrowmere were silent once more. Yet deep within that silence the Duke could still hear her song, faint, echoing, defiant, as if the house itself refused to forget. The storm broke over Harrowmere like a beast unleashed. The sea clawed at the cliffs, rain fell in furious sheets, and the wind screamed through the moors with a voice almost human. The servants barred the doors and crossed themselves, whispering that no soul should ride out in such weather. But the Duke of Harrowmere had never been a man ruled by fear, except perhaps the fear of his own heart, and tonight that heart was the only compass he had left. He mounted his horse before dawn, rain lashing his face like penance, his cloak whipped violently in the wind, his boots sinking into the sodden ground. He did not wait for a lantern or guide. He needed no direction. He knew, with the certainty of a man haunted, where she would go. Eveline had always spoken of the old chapel near the cliffs, where her mother once prayed, where the sea's hymn was loudest. If she was anywhere, it would be there. As he rode through the darkness, the world narrowed to sound, the thunder's deep roar, the relentless drumming of hooves, and the echo of her song playing like memory behind his ribs. He thought of her small hands, of her voice lifting through the hall, of how she had looked the last night he saw her, eyes shimmering like glass, trying to be brave. Fool, he whispered to himself, you let her go. Each mile was a confession, each gust of rain a judgment. He thought of Celeste, the night she died, the same kind of storm, the same desperate ride through the night. But this time, he told himself, he would not arrive too late. The road twisted through the moor, half swallowed by fog. Once his horse stumbled, nearly throwing him. He pressed on, soaked to the bone, his breath coming in ragged bursts. Every shadow seemed to whisper her name. At last, through the veil of rain, he saw it, the old stone chapel, half collapsed, crouching at the cliff's edge. Its stained glass windows were broken, its bell long silenced. But inside, a faint light flickered, one candle wavering in the wind. He dismounted and staggered to the door. His hand shook as he pushed it open. There she was. Eveline sat near the altar, her cloak damp and torn, her hair unbound and clinging to her face. She looked up in shock as he entered, his tall frame filling the doorway like a ghost, dragged back from the grave. "Your Grace!" she gasped, rising to her feet. "What are you doing here?" He stepped toward her, dripping, breathless. "What am I doing here?" he repeated hoarsely. "I might ask you the same." Her voice faltered. I thought it best to go before I brought you more trouble." "Trouble?" His laugh was bitter, half-choked. "You think gossip matters to me? You think I could breathe in that house without your voice?" She stared at him, trembling. "The world will never let you forget who I am." "Then let it talk," he thundered. "Let it choke on its own venom. I've lived half my life obeying the world's silence, Eveline. It brought me nothing but ghosts." The wind howled through the broken window, extinguishing the candle. In the darkness, only their voices and the storm remained. "You fear love," she said softly, "not because it hurts, but because it changes you." His voice broke. "I fear it because I don't deserve it." She stepped closer. No one who listens to a broken song can be beyond redemption. Something inside him cracked then, something that had been waiting years to shatter. He sank to his knees on the cold stone floor before her, rainwater pooling around him. "I swore I'd never kneel to love again," he whispered. "But if it means you'll stay, if it means I'll hear your song for one more day, I'll kneel until my bones turn to dust." Her tears fell freely now, mingling with the rain. She reached out, her hands trembling, and cupped his face. "Adrian," she breathed, calling him by name for the first time. "You were never cursed. You were just waiting to be heard." He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, as if it were light itself. "Then hear me now," he murmured. "Stay. Come back to Harrowmere, not as a servant, but as the only thing that ever made me whole." For a long moment she said nothing. The storm raged, the sea roared below, and the ruined chapel seemed to hold its breath. Then at last she nodded. "I will," she whispered, "if you promise not to silence the song again." He smiled, truly smiled, for the first time in 10 years. "Then let the house sing and let the world listen." He rose and took her hand, leading her out into the rain. The storm began to ease, as though the sky itself had tired of mourning, and when they reached the cliffs the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon, washing the sea in pale gold. He turned to her, his coat dripping, his voice rough but tender. "You found me in silence," he said. "Now teach me how to live in sound." Eveline squeezed his hand. "Then listen, my lord, it begins again." And as they walked back toward Harrowmere, the storm faded behind them, not in defeat, but in surrender. They reached Harrowmere at dawn. The manor rose from the mist like something reborn, its grey towers bathed in the first shy light of morning, the storm's residue still glittering along its stone. The gates stood open, as if the house itself had been waiting. For years it had been a mausoleum, haunted by silence and grief. Now, for the first time, it felt alive. The servants who had gathered anxiously in the courtyard through the night gasped when they saw them. Eveline, drenched and pale but unbroken, her hand clasped in the Duke's. The great Adrian Blackwell, who had not been seen beyond his chambers after sunset in years, stood beside her, his expression raw with exhaustion and something unmistakably human. Mrs. Pendry was the first to move. "Thank the Lord," she whispered, tears filling her lined eyes. "The sea gives back what it takes, just this once." Adrian glanced at her, his voice low but steady. "The house has been dead long enough. It's time it lived again." Eveline swayed, her strength waning, but he caught her before she could fall. "You've done enough brave things for one night," he murmured. "Come inside." He carried her past the threshold himself. The halls, still dim from stormlight, seemed to tremble at their passing. The portraits that lined the corridor, those silent witnesses to generations of sorrow, appeared softer somehow, as though they too approved. When Eveline awoke later that morning, she found herself in a chamber she had never seen, a grand room overlooking the sea, the air rich with salt and sunlight. She started up in alarm, realizing she was no longer in the servants' wing. Then the door opened, and he entered. He was changed. Gone was the Duke of mourning attire and withdrawn silence. He wore no coat, his sleeves rolled, the colour back in his face. There was still the scar, still the sadness, but it no longer defined him. It only framed the man who remained. "You should be resting," he said gently. "I should be cleaning floors," she replied, half smiling. "Not any more." He set a tray of food beside her. "Eat. Mrs. Pendry will see to the rest." "Mrs. Pendry?" Eveline asked cautiously. She doesn't mind?" He smiled faintly. "She minds everything, but she also believes this house owes you a debt." Outside, the storm's remnants began to fade, the clouds pulling apart to reveal a wash of blue sky. From the courtyard came the distant laughter of servants, an unfamiliar sound at Harrowmere. Even the horses neighed more freely, as though the estate itself had shed a long-held breath. By afternoon, Adrian descended to the great hall. The household gathered in confusion when he ordered the long-shrouded ballroom to be reopened. "Uncover the mirrors," he said. "Light every candle. Clean the piano." The servants hesitated. They had not heard music in that room since Lady Celeste's death. "Forgive me, Your Grace," one ventured nervously, "but do you mean to hold a gathering?" "I mean," Adrian said, his voice carrying like quiet thunder, "to stop living as if the dead are the only ones who deserve joy." And so, as the day waned, Harrowmere was transformed. Dust sheets were pulled away, revealing chandeliers that caught the fading sunlight and shattered it into 1,000 tiny stars. The floor was polished, the hearth relit, and when Eveline descended the grand staircase in a simple gown borrowed from Mrs. Pendry's youth, the house fell utterly silent. The Duke stood at the piano, his hand resting lightly on its lid. "Do you remember," he said softly, "what you told me in the chapel? That love doesn't kill. Grief does?" She nodded. He pressed one key. The note rang out, pure and clear. "Then sing, Eveline. Sing for every voice this house has buried." She hesitated only a moment before stepping forward. Her song began softly, weaving through the air like sunlight on water. The melody rose, swelling through the ballroom until it filled every corner of the house. The servants, awe-struck, stood motionless. Even the wind outside seemed to hush to listen. The Duke watched her, his chest tight with something like awe. For years he had feared that love meant loss, that music meant mourning. But as her voice soared, he realized that love, like song, did not demand perfection, it demanded courage. When the final note faded, the silence that followed was not the hollow quiet of grief, but the peace of fulfillment. Mrs. Pendry dabbed her eyes with her handkerchief. One by one, the servants began to applaud, hesitant at first, then louder, until the great hall trembled with life. Adrian stepped forward, offering his hand. "Eveline," he said, "you've done what I thought impossible. You've made Harrowmere remember how to feel." She looked at him, her heart in her throat. "And what does it feel now, my lord?" He smiled, a smile that reached his eyes at last. "Alive." Outside, the bells of the distant village chapel began to ring, carried on the wind as if blessing what had been reborn. Harrowmere had awakened. But beyond the manor's stone walls, not everyone rejoiced. From his carriage on the distant road, Sir Halbert watched the ballroom windows blaze with light, his expression sour. "Let him think himself redeemed," he murmured darkly. "Every man has a weakness, and she'll be his." By the end of that week, word of the miracle at Harrowmere had travelled farther than the moors. In nearby villages they whispered of candlelight in windows long dark, of laughter echoing through stone halls that once belonged to ghosts. The London gentry, ever hungry for scandal dressed as wonder, began to speak again of Adrian Blackwell, the Duke who had buried his bride and his heart in the same night. Only now the story had changed. He hosts music again, they said. He lets a servant girl sing in his ballroom, and they say even the walls weep with joy. Invitations began to arrive, curious noblemen, sympathetic ladies, old family acquaintances who had once mourned Celeste and now smelled the perfume of gossip. Adrian ignored them all. But when a letter came from Lord Pembroke, the Duke's oldest ally, it bore a simple request. Return to the world, Adrian, if not for yourself, then for what you have rebuilt. The world deserves to hear it. It was Eveline who convinced him. Let them come, she said quietly. If they see what kindness looks like, perhaps they will stop calling it scandal. He studied her face for a long time, the courage there, the quiet steadiness that had always unsettled him. They will judge you, he warned. She smiled faintly. They already do. And so Harrowmere's doors opened once more, this time not for mourning, but for music. The ballroom was draped in gold and white, the chandeliers newly polished, the marble floors gleaming. Candles lined every ledge, their flames mirrored in crystal and glass, until the whole room seemed to shimmer. Guests arrived in silks, and jewels whispering behind fans as they beheld the reborn hall and its master. The Duke has changed, one murmured. He looks 10 years younger, said another. Grief becomes him no longer. But the whispers turned sharper when they saw Eveline, standing at the far end of the ballroom, dressed in a pale gown of simple elegance, her hair pinned loosely, her eyes downcast. That's her? A lady hissed. The housemaid? A housemaid with a duchess's grace, a gentleman murmured. And a siren's courage, it seems. When Adrian entered, the crowd fell silent. He wore a coat of deep blue velvet, the same shade he had worn when he buried Celeste, but tonight, instead of mourning, it was rebirth. His scar caught the light, no longer something to hide. He moved with quiet dignity, every step deliberate, every gaze certain. He stopped beside Eveline. They expect a performance, he said under his breath. Then we shall give them one worth remembering, she whispered. He nodded to the orchestra, newly hired musicians from London, and as the first soft chords filled the air, Eveline stepped forward. Her voice rose gently, threading through the strings like dawn light through fog. The song she sang was not her mother's lullaby, nor Celeste's tragic sonata. It was something new, born of both sorrow and hope. Each note seemed to reach into the hearts of those listening, pulling forth something forgotten, a memory, a regret, a flicker of faith. And as she sang, the Duke's gaze never left her. The room faded, the chandeliers, the crowd, even the past. There was only her voice, washing through him like forgiveness itself. Halfway through the song, a sudden crack echoed through the hall. One of the great portraits, the one draped in black, slid from the wall and crashed to the floor. Gasps rippled through the guests. When the dust settled, the shroud had torn away, revealing the portrait of Lady Celeste Montrose, her painted eyes staring out, as if startled awake. Eveline faltered for the briefest second, but Adrian did not. He stepped forward, his voice calm but resonant. "Leave it," he commanded. "Let her rest. Her time has passed." The crowd watched, spellbound, as he turned back to Eveline. "Continue," he said softly. Your song belongs here." And she did. Her voice rose higher, surer, the sound filling every corner of the ballroom, even the broken silence behind Celeste's fallen frame. It became more than song, it was prayer, absolution, rebirth. When the final note trembled into stillness, many guests found tears on their faces without knowing why. Adrian reached for her hand, unashamed, before the crowd. "You've done what I could not," he said, his voice low but carrying. "You made Harrowmere live again. You made me live again." She tried to speak, but emotion stole her words. So instead, she bowed her head slightly and whispered, "Then keep living, my lord. Don't let grief take what music restored." He smiled, turning to the assembled guests. "My friends," he said, "you came to witness a novelty. Instead, you have witnessed resurrection." The crowd erupted, not in mockery, but in awe. Even those who had come seeking scandal now clapped with trembling hands. They saw not disgrace, but something pure and undeniable, a love that had dared the impossible. As the orchestra swelled once more, Adrian offered Eveline his hand. "Dance with me," he murmured. "But no one who brings a house back to life should stand in its shadows," he said, smiling. And so they danced, slowly, gracefully, beneath the glittering light. For the first time in years, the Duke of Harrowmere danced again, not with a ghost, but with the woman who had given him back his heart. Outside, the sea was calm, the cliffs shining under the moonlight. Harrowmere Hall, once a tomb of sorrow, stood radiant and alive. And somewhere, in the corner, unseen, Mrs. Pendry wiped her eyes and whispered to the air, "The curse is broken." When dawn came to Harrowmere, it came quietly, like a prayer whispered over the moors. The storms were gone, and the world seemed washed clean. Mist curled along the gardens, dew clung to the roses, and sunlight poured through the high windows, striking sparks from the chandeliers that had glittered through the night. The guests had gone, leaving the manor wrapped in that strange hush that follows joy, a peace almost too deep to touch. Eveline stood by the great window in the ballroom, gazing out over the cliffs. The sea shimmered pale gold beneath the rising sun, calm and vast. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt no weight pressing on her heart. There was silence now, but it was not the heavy silence of sorrow. It was the stillness of fulfillment. Behind her, footsteps approached, measured, familiar. She turned. Adrian stood there, his dark hair still damp from the morning air, his eyes bright in the light. The storm had left its mark on him, his coat torn at the sleeve, a faint bruise along his temple, but he wore it all as though they were medals earned in a private war. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice soft. She shook her head. "I wanted to see the morning." He came to stand beside her. Together they looked out over the gardens, where the servants were beginning to stir. Mrs. Pendry was already directing 2 footmen to rehang the curtains, and somewhere in the courtyard laughter rang out, light and free. "It feels different," Eveline said quietly. "It is," Adrian replied. "For 10 years I thought dawn was only for other men. I buried myself before the earth did, but you—" He paused, searching for words. "You taught me to listen again, and in listening, I found my heart." Eveline smiled faintly. "Then keep listening, my lord. Music never ends. It only waits for someone brave enough to hear it." He turned to her fully then, his expression tender, unguarded. "Brave enough," he repeated, almost to himself. "I thought bravery was surviving war or enduring loss. I never knew it could be as simple as asking someone to stay." He took her hands, calloused and work-worn, but delicate in his grasp. "Eveline Hart," he said softly, "you entered my house as a servant, and you gave it back its soul. You entered my life as a stranger, and you gave me back myself. I would see no more walls between us, no ranks, no ghosts, no silences. Her breath caught. "Adrian!" He dropped to one knee before she could speak further. The motion was so sudden, so reverent, that she froze. Sunlight caught the scar along his cheek and turned it to silver. "Once," he said, voice trembling, "I knelt to kings, to God, and to grief. None of them gave me peace. Now I kneel to you, not for forgiveness, but for forever." A tear slipped down her cheek. "My lord, what are you asking?" He smiled, that quiet, half-wistful smile that had once seemed impossible on his face. "Be my equal, be my music, be my home." The world seemed to still, the waves pausing, the light holding its breath. Eveline lowered herself to her knees before him and took his face between her hands. "You foolish man," she whispered. "You never needed saving. You only needed to be heard." "And you heard me," he murmured. "I did," she said, "and I will, every day." Their lips met softly, without spectacle or audience, just two souls, long denied peace, finding it at last. Outside, the chapel bell in the distant village began to toll, its notes carried on the wind. Later that morning, when the household gathered in the courtyard, the Duke led Eveline down the grand staircase. No announcement was made, no proclamation needed. The sight of them together, his hand resting over hers, his gaze unashamed, was enough. Even the servants who had once whispered fell silent, some smiling, some wiping at their eyes. "Mrs. Pendry," Adrian said gently as they passed, "have the ballroom prepared again. There will be music tonight." The old woman curtsied, her voice thick with emotion. "As it should be, my lord. The house will sing for you both." And it did. That evening, as twilight wrapped the manor in rose and gold, the piano filled the air once more, not with sorrow, but with a melody of joy. The Duke played, awkward at first, while Eveline stood beside him, guiding his hands, laughing when he missed a note. The servants listened from the hall, smiling, and outside, the sea kept time against the rocks. When the final chord faded, Adrian turned to her, his voice quiet but certain. "They said I feared love," he murmured. "They were right. Until you." She laid her head against his shoulder. "And now?" He looked toward the window where the first stars were appearing. "Now," he said, "I fear silence." She smiled, closing her eyes. "Then we'll fill it with music, with laughter, with everything we were once too afraid to say." The fire crackled, the house glowed, and the echoes of their song lingered long after the night fell. And so, the Duke who feared love found it, not in titles nor in grandeur, but in the simplest truth of all, that even the loneliest hearts can learn to sing again, if only someone dares to listen.